The villagers say the soil here remembers everything. It remembers the first scream of a newborn. It remembers the iron tang of blood soaking into its roots. It remembers the trembling hands of a parent digging the hole, not too deep, not too shallow, where a single seed is buried with a drop of blood still warm. In the village of Doyum, every child is planted twice, once from a womb, once into the earth. When Lum's daughter was born on a fog-heavy morning, the midwife barely wiped the crimson smear from her cheeks before turning to him with the bowl, a dull bronze dish passed from hand to hand for centuries. Inside it, one perfectly round dark red seed. Its surface glistened like it was alive, like it was waiting. Lum had always been a quiet man, strong of back and short of word, but when he looked into his daughter's eyes still adjusting to the light, his hands trembled. He took the bone pin from the midwife, pricked the baby's heel, and let one drop fall onto the seed. The seed twitched, not visibly, not to anyone else, but he felt it, in his bones, in the pit of his stomach. The elder stood beside him and whispered the rites. One drop to bind, one life to feed, one root to hold. The villagers gathered silently outside his home, holding lanterns dimmed with cloth, as the procession walked to the planting field, a place no one spoke of, but all knew. No one ever pointed, no one ever taught the way, but when your child was born, your feet led you there without asking. Lum dug with his bare hands. The seed, now sticky with blood, was placed into the hole. The soil was pressed over it. A rock was set atop it, not to mark it, that was forbidden, but to weigh it down, to keep it sleeping. The elder handed Lum a pinch of rice ash and whispered, "It will grow with her, but she must never see it, not even in dream." And that was that. No name, no sign, no return. It was the way of things in Doyum. By sunset, the villagers were gone. The midwife had packed her tools. The lanterns were cold. And Lum, holding his sleeping daughter in his arms, stood at the edge of the field, listening to the earth breathe beneath him. The seed had been planted, and something beneath the soil had begun to stir.
7 years later, the village bells rang at an hour they never should. Not at dawn, not at dusk, but in the still gray silence before the roosters called. It was the sound of mourning. Lem sat motionless on the edge of the cot, one hand still cradling his daughter's foot. It was cold, not yet stiff, but lifeless, in a way that made his breath catch every few seconds, like his body forgot how to function without hers. She had been laughing just the night before, chasing fireflies near the rice paddies, shoeless, wind in her tangled hair, alive. Now she lay still, eyes shut, mouth parted as if mid-sentence. No wounds, no fever, no sign of struggle. Just gone. The village healer came, wrinkled, silent, eyes clouded with the weight of having seen too much. She examined the girl's fingers, her soles, her tongue. Then she placed one hand over the child's chest and another beneath her back, as if measuring something not of the body. Then she said only this: she was called. No one asked who had called her. No one needed to. The funeral was short. That was tradition. Death in Doyum was not to be lingered on. The soul must not hear the cries of the living, or it might refuse to leave. But Lem didn't cry.
Not at the funeral, not when they burned her little blanket, not when the midwife returned to collect the small clay bowl she had used 7 years prior. He only stood there, watching the wind shift the ashes, listening to the villagers murmur prayers through teeth that never opened wide enough to speak real words. And that night, when the air was thick with summer gnats and the soil still damp from afternoon rain, Lem did the unthinkable. He returned to the planting field. The old path had no signs. The trees pressed close, as if trying to hold him back. The air was thick and warm, but his skin crawled with cold. He passed stones, hundreds, all unmarked, all seemingly the same. But his feet stopped at one. A small gray stone cracked down the center, just like the one he had laid 7 years ago, just like the one the seed now slumbered under. He stood there for a long time. He should not be here. It was forbidden, not by law, but by something older, something that lived in the soil, something that did not speak, but made itself understood in the rustling of the roots below. Still, he knelt. Still, he dug. His hands moved slowly, reverently, as if peeling back the skin of something sacred. The earth gave way too easily, as if it too had waited for this moment. And then, his fingers touched something smooth, not like root, not like stone, but soft, moist. He pulled back a layer of dirt and froze. There, curled beneath the ground, was a figure. Pale, small, shaped like a child. But not his daughter. No, this thing had no skin. Its surface was bark-like but pliable, like wet paper. Its eyes were shut, but sap leaked slowly from the corners. Its limbs were twisted in on themselves, wrapped with tiny tendrils of root. And when Lem reached out in horror, it opened its mouth and whispered, "Father." The air shattered, the ground throbbed, and somewhere in the fields beyond, a baby began to scream. Not one still alive, but one already buried. And it was screaming from beneath the earth. Lum stumbled backward, his palms caked with dirt and sap that clung like spit. The thing in the soil had closed its mouth again, but the words still rang in his ears, not as sound, but as sensation, as if his bones had been the ones to hear it. Father. He clutched his chest, his heart pounded, not from fear, but from something deeper, something that pulsed in time with the field around him. For a moment he swore the soil itself was breathing. He looked down again. The child thing hadn't moved, still curled in on itself, still weeping sap from eyes that never opened, still half-rooted to the earth by tiny threads that grew out of its spine and into the ground below. It should have been a tree. That's what the elders said, that every child's soul, once bound to the blood seed, would grow into a tree in the hidden field, a silent guardian, a sacred tether. But this was no tree. This was a body. Behind him, the trees groaned. Branches cracked in the still air. Leaves whispered secrets he could not understand. The weight of centuries pressed on the back of his neck. And yet, Lum did not run. Instead, he dropped to his knees again. He reached out, fingers trembling, and brushed a bit of dirt from the creature's face. Its skin, if it could be called that, was smooth and waxy like half-melted candle. Beneath the grime, it had her cheekbones, her nose, the same slight cleft in the chin that made her daughter look like she was always smirking. It wasn't her, but it remembered her, and that, somehow, was worse. "Lum!" The voice shattered the silence like a thrown stone. He turned sharply. A figure stood at the edge of the field, holding a lantern wrapped in red cloth, its light barely enough to carve shape out of the night. It was Ba Hoi, the midwife. Her mouth was a thin line, her eyes storm cloud dark. "You dug," she whispered, stepping closer. "Dear gods, you dug." Lum couldn't speak. Ba Hoi looked past him, and the little color left in her face drained completely. "You need to cover it, now." He shook his head. It spoke. "No," she snapped. It echoed. "There's a difference. Whatever's left of your child, that's not it. That's what the root keeps behind when the soul has gone." He looked down again. The child's shape was twitching now, ever so slightly, as if hearing them or responding. "She didn't die naturally," he whispered. "There was no illness, no injury, just emptiness, like something took her." Ba Hoi knelt beside him, placed her hand over the thing's head. "That's because something did, and now that you've unearthed her tether, it knows it can return." "Return as what?" She didn't answer. Instead, she began scooping dirt back into the hole with shaking hands. This field was never meant to be visited. Each seed is a lock, a gate. If you open it... The sap child shuddered. Its limbs stretched an inch longer. A finger twitched and broke free of the roots. Then something walks through. Lum tried to help, but his hands wouldn't stop shaking. The soil felt wrong now, too warm, too wet, like flesh, and under our feet something was shifting. Do others know? Do they know what these seeds really are? Ba Hoi didn't look up. They suspect, but they pretend. It's safer that way. We all know not to dig. That's the first rule, the only rule. And what if someone else does? The midwife froze. Then she whispered, almost too softly to hear. Then the roots will rise. The wind picked up, sudden and sharp, carrying with it a sound neither of them could name. Not crying, not wind, not human, but close enough to make you listen. And beneath their feet, the earth began to hum. The humming grew louder with every breath. It wasn't sound in the air, it was vibration in the bone. A deep, guttural resonance that seemed to come from beneath the skin of the world itself. Lum could feel it rising through his fingertips as he pressed the dirt back over the sap child's body, as if the earth disapproved, or worse, hungered. Beside him, Ba Hoi chanted something under her breath, not the usual blessings. This was older, tongue-twisting, almost broken. Her words were not prayers, but bargains. Hold it down, hold it shut, keep the root from rising. Lum forced himself to stay focused, shoveling more soil with his bare hands until the pale, waxy shape was buried again. But he knew it wouldn't matter. It had already seen him, already spoken to him, already remembered. When they finally stood up, their clothes were soaked in sweat and dirt. Ba Hoit's lantern flickered, sputtered once, then died completely. The moon offered no help. It had slipped behind clouds, like it too didn't want to witness what came next. "Walk," she said flatly. "Now. Don't speak, don't look back." They left the field without another word. But as Lum crossed the tree line, he glanced over his shoulder. Just once. And in that instant, He saw dozens of other stones, motionless for generations, now faintly pulsing beneath the soil, like hearts, beating. Back at his home, the night pressed against the windows like a held breath. He sat alone by the hearth, the fire burned low, and his daughter's blanket still lay folded in the corner, the one she used to carry everywhere, even when it was too hot for cloth. He reached for it without thinking, then pulled his hand away. Everything smelled like soil now, even his skin, especially his skin. A knock at the door startled him. He opened it to find the village elder standing there, staff in one hand and a small clay vessel in the other. The old man's eyes were almost closed, but sharp as knives beneath the lids. "Bring this to the girl's stone before dawn. Spill it, all of it." Lam hesitated. I buried it back. I didn't mean to." "You meant to mourn. That's what broke it. The bond is cracked. If it opens fully, it will not be your daughter who returns." Lam's stomach turned. "What will it be?" The elder stepped closer, pressed the clay vessel into his hands. Inside, something sloshed thickly, not liquid, not quite. A spirit doesn't grow in the tree. It's held in the tree, like sap in bark. You opened the wound. Now you must feed it, or it will feed on us. That night, he dreamed of roots. Not trees, not branches, just roots. Slithering like veins through the soil, pulsing with breath and memory. Some were wrapped around bones, others curled around old teeth, rusted toys, hair combs. And in the center of it all, a root that looked like a spine, curled around something small, something humming, something waiting. He woke before dawn, the vessel still clutched in his hand. He didn't want to go, but he knew now, the longer he waited, the louder it would call. And not just to him. The air before dawn was too still. No dogs barking, no birds stirring, not even the wind dared move. Lam stood at the edge of the forbidden field once more, the small clay vessel cradled in both hands. It had grown warm overnight, almost feverish, and the faint, sour-sweet smell seeping from the lid reminded him of spoiled milk mixed with something alive, something breathing. He hesitated, not because of fear, he had passed that point, but because a part of him still wanted to believe it could be undone, that if he buried the memory deep enough, the ground would keep the secret for him. But the soil was no longer silent. When his foot crossed into the field, the humming returned. This time not deep and hidden, but clear, rising from under every stone like dozens of buried mouths exhaling in unison. He could feel it against his ribs, in his teeth. He didn't need to search for her place. His body took him there, as if the ground remembered the shape of his grief. The stone he had once laid was now cracked in 3 places, and beneath it the dirt had swollen, pushed up from within, like something underneath had grown impatient. Lam knelt, placed the vessel beside him. His fingers hovered over the loose soil. "I'm sorry," he whispered, not to the thing below, to her, to the girl who should have been just memory, not flesh, not root. Then he unstoppered the vessel. The stench hit him first, sharp and metallic, like rotting blood soaked into wood. Inside the jar was not liquid, but a thick,
glistening pulp, the color of bruised fruit. It shimmered in the dawn's pale light, and as it moved, it almost seemed to breathe. He poured it slowly onto the mound. The earth hissed. Steam rose, not from heat, but from reaction. The pulp soaked into the dirt unnaturally fast, vanishing into the soil like it had been thirsty, desperate. Then the silence shattered. From beneath the ground came a voice, not words, not even sound truly, but a feeling pressed into his mind like a vine curling around his thoughts, squeezing. Hungry. Then, Father? And suddenly, all across the field, other stones began to move. One rolled aside, another cracked open. A third collapsed inward, revealing soil that writhed, not like dirt, but like flesh twitching beneath torn cloth. Lam staggered backward, his vision blurred. He wasn't just hearing the voice now, he was sharing it. Memories poured into him, not his own. A child buried beneath black soil, dreaming of light. A root twisting through a rib cage, a scream that never reached the air. The sensation of being tied, not to safety, but to something watching, feeding. He clutched his head, fell to his knees, vomited bile into the grass. The first child walked out of the field just before the sun rose. It wasn't his. A neighbor's boy, Dot, age 6, but his face was wrong, too smooth, too pale, and his eyes were wet with something golden and slow. He opened his mouth and said in a woman's voice, "Why did you dig?" Behind him, other children began to emerge from the tree line, sleepwalking, barefoot, eyes unfocused. Some whispered to themselves, some wept. One girl sang a lullaby in a language no one in the village had ever taught. Lam backed away as Dot stepped closer. The boy held out his hand, and from the tips of his fingers dangled rootlets, thin, red-veined tendrils that twitched in the morning breeze. Then he smiled, and behind the teeth was wood. Lam turned and ran. As he fled, he heard the earth behind him sigh, not in relief, but in release, as if something old had finally exhaled after centuries, as if something bound had now begun to loosen. The next day, no one spoke of what happened. Not at the well, not in the fields, not even in whispers behind closed doors. The village had entered what the old ones called Dorikam, the time of silence. It was not declared, it was simply understood and feared. Children who had wandered from their beds returned before dawn, blank-eyed and humming in their sleep. Parents found them standing in corners, covered in soil from the knees down. One girl had seed husks in her mouth. Another woke with bruises shaped like roots winding around her legs. But still, no one spoke. Instead, doors were locked early. Salt lines were drawn across thresholds. Old talismans, once used for warding livestock sickness, were nailed to every post and shutter. And in the center of it all, Lam sat alone. He had not slept. His hands still smelled of that thick sap pulp he poured into the soil. His dreams were not dreams anymore. They were memories that didn't belong to him. He saw the moment the first blood seed was planted, generations ago. A baby crying in the arms of a grieving widow. An elder whispering, "Let the root remember what the body cannot." He saw the faces of children whose trees had withered too soon and what came crawling out of the dirt to replace them. And he saw himself, bending over his daughter's stone,
breaking the only rule the village had never dared question. That evening, as the village lay suffocating beneath its forced quiet, Lam heard a soft knock, 3 taps, a pause, then one. He opened the door to find Ba Hoi standing in the shadows, her shawl soaked from the evening mist. "Come," she said, "before the moon rises." They walked past the edge of the fields into the old chapel, a crumbling wooden structure hidden beneath layers of moss and thyme. It hadn't been used in decades, not since the rituals moved into the open fields. Inside, a circle of elders sat on woven mats, eyes shut, lips pressed tightly. At the center of the room was a clay bowl filled with earth. It moved, breathed. One of the elders finally opened his eyes and looked at Lam. "You broke the pact." Lam did not respond. "You unearthed what should remain rooted. You fed it, you gave it voice. Now it listens, now it speaks." Lam clenched his jaw. "It was my daughter." "No, it looked like your daughter, but the root takes shape from memory. What it gives back is never whole, never pure." He stepped forward, fists trembling. "Then tell me what they are. The sap, the voices, the roots in their mouths. Tell me what we've buried." Silence. Then Ba Hoi spoke. "We never planted trees." The words dropped like stone in still water. She continued quietly. "That's the lie we told ourselves. The seeds are not seeds. They are vessels, grown from pain, shaped by blood. We do not grow soul trees. We trap something in the dirt and ask it to love us." A long pause. "Sometimes it listens. Sometimes it mimics." Lam stared at the bowl of breathing earth. "They said it was protection," he whispered. "For the children." Ba Hoi nodded. "It was, but not for their souls, for ours. As long as we left the roots undisturbed, the thing beneath stayed asleep. In return, we lived, we harvested, we thrived. And when someone breaks the soil," she looked at him with deep, tired eyes, "then the roots remember, and they reach." One elder stood and walked to the far wall, pulling away a rotten panel. Behind it was a stone slab carved with ancient symbols, tree shapes with twisted, screaming faces. Lam stared. It wasn't a tree. It never had been. It was a cage. And now, one of the doors had been opened. It began with the rice. The first stalks sprouted overnight, 3 months too early, but their grains were black. Not the deep, rich kind of black that meant fertility and strength, but a dull, rotting color that made the villagers afraid to touch them. When the farmers tried to pull the stalks, they bled. Not sap, not dye, but a thin, watery red, like the field itself remembered every drop of blood ever offered and had decided to return it. Then came the second bloom. In the fields closest to the planting grounds, dozens of mounds began to rise. Small at first, barely noticeable, but they spread in circular patterns like ripples in a pond, each centered around an unmarked burial stone. Lam stood at the edge of one such mound, his hands wrapped in cloth, shovel clutched tight, breath shallow. He wasn't here to dig again, not after what he had seen. He was here to watch, because the soil had started to move on its own. A shift, a breath, a push from below, And then, like fruit rotting in reverse, the earth split. What emerged wasn't a tree, and it wasn't fully human either. The villagers began calling them Boop-mum-lang, the silent buds. They were shaped like children, roughly. Limbs made of thick root and waxy tissue, skin that glistened like candle drippings. Their eyes never opened, but they breathed. You could see the rise and fall of their chests. You could hear the soft whistle of air moving in and out. And if you got close enough, you could feel the warmth radiating from their bodies, like newborns swaddled in dirt. But the worst part? They whispered. Not in any language the villagers knew, just fragments, memories, sounds, laughter, sobbing, like someone had torn pages from lives long gone and stuffed them into lungs that shouldn't have existed. Lam watched one of the Boop-mum-lang rise fully. It stood on its root-like feet, unsteady but not afraid. Its head tilted slowly, as if listening for something only it could hear. Then, with its mouth still closed, it spoke into his mind. "You fed me." He dropped the shovel and stumbled back. The whisper didn't fade. It curled into his thoughts, clinging like fog behind the eyes. "You named me. You broke the soil. I remember." It took a step forward. The roots trailing from its legs left tiny holes in the dirt, each one steaming, bleeding the same red mist that had filled the air the night he broke the pact. Across the village, more Boop-mum-lang were rising. Some crawled, some stood, some lay still but breathing, waiting, and the villagers could no longer pretend. The silence broke. That night, a town meeting was held, the first in generations. Held not in the communal house, but in the shadow of the old chapel. Every adult arrived with charms, salt bundles, rusted knives passed down through families for this exact kind of fear. The elder stood before them and asked only one question: "Who else has dug?" 5 hands rose. One woman wept. "My son fell into the river. I needed to know if he was safe." Another man confessed, "I missed my mother. I wanted to see the tree." A third trembled as he spoke. "It spoke to me in dreams. It sounded like my brother." Lam didn't raise his hand. He didn't need to. Everyone already knew. The elder looked at the gathered crowd. Then he said something no one wanted to hear. "The second bloom means the roots are no longer content with memory. They want bodies." That night, no one slept. And for the first time in 100 years, the earth spoke clearly. Not through omens, not through harvests, not through silence, but through voices, dozens of them, rising from the ground beneath beds, under floorboards, between cracks in stone. They weren't loud. They didn't scream. They whispered. And that made it worse. Lam sat with his back pressed to the wall, blanket draped over his shoulders like a shield. His oil lamp sputtered beside him, shadows twitching across the walls like vines. Outside, the village was quiet, but the soil beneath his house was not. He could hear her. Not the creature he dug up, not the sapling child that spoke through roots and hunger, but his daughter, the real one, the memory of her voice muffled through wood and earth. "Ba ơi, con lạnh quá." "Daddy, I'm cold." The voice didn't come from above. It came from below, from under the floor. He crawled to the center of the room and pressed his ear to the wooden boards. Silence. Then, Scratch. Soft, slow, like small fingers raking at the underside of the house. Not frantic, not trying to break through, just reminding him it was there. He scrambled back, heart thudding, breath caught in his throat. Then he heard another voice. This one wasn't his daughter. It was older, male, harsh. It said only one word: listen. At dawn, the village awoke to find messages carved into the earth, not written with tools, but etched by something burrowing just beneath the surface, along the walking paths, on walls made of packed dirt, even on rice stalks where the patterns of the veins had been twisted into strange looping symbols. Some villagers recognized the script. Old, forbidden. It belonged to the Ngon Tutgoe, the rootless tongue, a dialect from before the founding of the village, spoken only in ritual sacrifice and banishment rites. Bahoy gathered a group to translate. The messages were not warnings, they were instructions. Unbury the roots, feed the soil what was taken, return the blood to its tree. The branches remember, silence is betrayal. And one repeated phrase carved deep behind Lum's home: the root is hungry. By mid-morning, several families had fled. They packed what little they could and vanished into the forest trails, heading toward other villages, pretending they could outrun what had been planted. By nightfall, 2 of them returned, not alive. Their corpses were found just before the shrine, twisted into unnatural poses, jaws locked open, mouths full of dirt. Roots had erupted from their spines, wrapping their limbs like vines, trying to drag them back into the earth. No one fled again after that. That evening, as the sun bled red through the clouds, a new sound joined the whispers. Singing. A child's voice, high, broken, and slow, coming from the forbidden field. The villagers gathered behind closed doors, too afraid to follow the sound. But Lum, he stepped outside. The song was one his daughter used to hum while picking flowers. But the voice singing it now had no breath, just rhythm, just memory, just echo. And in the shadows of the field, among the mounds of breathing soil, he saw them, the Boop Mum Lung, lined up, still, heads tilted toward the village, mouths closed, but singing, not with voice, but with root. And the ground beneath his feet pulsed in time with the melody. Boom, boom, boom. Like a heartbeat, like something beneath was waking up. It began with a dream. Not a shared one, not at first. One by one, villagers woke in the middle of the night with dirt beneath their fingernails and soil on their tongues. Their hands bled from clawing at the ground, though none remembered doing it. Some had wandered into their gardens. Others were found asleep in the fields, curled beside the stones where seeds had been planted generations ago. One woman woke inside a shallow pit she had dug with her own hands, muttering the name of her stillborn daughter. By the end of the week, nearly a third of the village had been called. They called it Gunsoltalmol, the digging fever. But it wasn't just sleepwalking. It was compulsion, an itch in the soul. Lum saw it in the eyes of his neighbors, a hunger not for food or answers, but roots, a desire to touch something they had buried long ago and had never truly grieved. He heard one man sob, "Just a glimpse, just one look at her tree. I won't touch, I promise." He saw a child, no older than 5, use a stick to scrape open a crack in the earth and whisper into it, as though waiting for something to whisper back. And he watched as Ba Hoi, the one who had warned them all, dug up her own son's planting stone and found nothing. Just ash and hair and bones far too small to be called human. The fever spread fast, the nights grew louder, and the soil thinner. People dug not only at night, but in secret during the day. They lied about it, covered their hands, hid the dirt under their fingernails, but the field knew. It responded. Each stone disturbed caused another Boop Mum Lang to rise. Each seed tampered with sent out new whispers. Each broken rule made the ground breathe harder, deeper, as if every unearthing fed the lungs of something slumbering beneath the village's skin. The elders gathered in the chapel once more. "We have failed," said the oldest among them, his lips crusted with dried sap. "What is it then? What have we planted?" Ba Hoi answered with a voice drained of resistance. "We didn't plant trees. We planted reminders of loss, of longing, of hunger. Every drop of blood fed it. Every whisper of mourning kept it warm. And now? Now it remembers." Outside, the whispers rose again. But they weren't whispers anymore. They were words, clear, close, crawling through the cracks in the walls and the space between teeth. "The roots are open. You broke the pact. You fed the seed. Now you must bloom." Lum fled the chapel before anyone could stop him, not out of fear, but because he knew he wasn't sleepwalking anymore. His daughter was calling him not in dreams, but in full conscious thought. Her voice rang inside his skull like chimes wrapped in flesh. He didn't want to obey, but his feet moved on their own. He walked to the forbidden field again. This time there were no mounds, no shadows, just stillness. Until he noticed the stones were gone. All of them. The field was smooth now, soft, quiet, like the surface of a grave freshly filled. And in the center stood a figure, small, root-wrapped, familiar. Her eyes were open now, not eyes at all, but dark pits filled with glistening sap that dripped like tears. Her mouth moved without sound, but in his mind, Lum heard it loud and clear. "It hurts, Ba. Let me grow." The next morning, the village awoke to rot. The fields, once emerald waves of rice and maize, had turned overnight into a sea of blackened stalks. Not burned, not frozen, but withered from within, as if every drop of life had been sucked out by unseen mouths. The corn curled in on itself like fingers around nothing. The banana trees bore fruit that split open with red pulp and worm-like veins. Even the wild herbs along the riverbank reeked of decay, their leaves spotted with mold in the shape of open eyes. Worst of all were the water buffalo. 3 of them were found dead, their bellies bloated, eyes wide, hooves sunk deep in the mud, and around each one, Faint grooves in the soil spiraled outward like veins, as if the earth had reached up and drained them. Ba Hoi called an emergency gathering. No one argued. The entire village crammed into the chapel, now overrun with wilting charms, crumbling altars, and incense that did nothing to mask the sour smell seeping up from the dirt floor. The elder stepped forward. His hands trembled, not from age, but from fear. The pact has collapsed, and the soil no longer feeds us. It feeds itself. Murmurs, then panic. What do we do? Can we rebind it? Should we burn the field? No, Ba Hoi said flat. You don't burn what remembers your blood. You apologize to it. Lam stood in the back, eyes hollow. He hadn't spoken since the night before, since he saw her standing there, sap dripping from her cheeks, asking to grow. He remembered the look on her face, not pain, not anger, something worse, longing, like a seed straining against the dark, desperate for light, even if it had to tear through flesh to reach it. That night, the soil began to move again, not gently, not in whispers, but with violence. The ground near the forbidden field split open, a long, jagged wound in the earth, stretching like a mouth mid-scream. And from it crawled dozens of half-formed boot mom, some still fused with roots, others dragging broken limbs behind them, all glowing faintly with golden sap. They did not speak. They did not scream. They only stood, silent, watching the village from the edge of the dark. And behind them, the field pulsed, not visually, but spiritually. The villagers felt it in their teeth, in their dreams, in their blood. A thrum, a rhythm, a message. The roots are awake. You took too much. Now we take back. The children were the first to change. They began speaking in plural. We are tired. We are cold. We are growing. Some drew spirals on walls in ash. Others stopped eating, but their bellies swelled as if filled with something else. One boy pulled a worm from his ear and whispered, "It told me the seed wants sunlight." Lam visited the field again, alone. It was no longer a field. It was a cradle. The soil had softened into a pulpy bed, pulsing faintly, as if something enormous lay just beneath the surface, curled in sleep. His daughter stood in the center, not moving, not breathing, but alive in the way a flame is alive before it devours the house. He dropped to his knees. "Please," he whispered, "I just wanted to know if you were safe." She tilted her head. "I was never gone. You buried me. You fed me. Now let me bloom." And behind her, something moved. Not seen, but sensed. The shape beneath the field. Something old. Something hungry. Something made of every grief that had ever been offered to the soil. And as the crops died and the children changed, it began to rise. At first, they thought she was a hallucination. The village had gone without real sleep for days. Paranoia clung to their skin like smoke. It made sense that someone would see a child-shaped shadow and imagine the worst. But then she stepped into the morning light, and there was no doubt. It was her, Lam's daughter, the one they had buried, the one he had dug up, the one that had wept sap and whispered, "Father," from beneath the soil. Now she stood at his doorstep, barefoot, wearing the same tattered blue aozai she had died in. Only it wasn't frayed, it was growing. Threads of bark and root curling through the fabric, stitching themselves into her skin like veins. She looked up at him with eyes made of sap and smiled. Lam did not scream. He did not run. He did not call for the elders. He simply opened the door and let her in. She walked with careful, fragile steps, not because she was weak, but as if she were adjusting to the gravity of the living world. Each step left behind a faint trace of moisture on the floor, a golden, glistening trail. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence said everything. I am here. I am yours. I have returned. He sat her on the floor and tried to wipe her feet, but the cloth in his hand caught fire. Not with flame, but with rot. It turned black, disintegrated into powder the moment it touched her skin. Still, she didn't flinch. She simply reached for his hand and held it. Her fingers were warm, not alive warm, soil warm, like sun-baked roots, and her pulse, if it could be called that, throbbed in slow, heavy beats that seemed to echo inside his chest, as if she were sinking with him, becoming part of him. The village did not question her return, not aloud, but they watched. From doorways, behind curtains, across rice paddies that now crumbled into dust when touched. The children stopped playing. The elders stopped praying. Even the boopmamam lining the field grew still, as if waiting for their firstborn to take her place. Because she was different. She was not one of them. She had gone into the soil and come back out with memory. That night, she stood by the window for hours, unmoving, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Lam watched her from the shadows. At one point, she raised her hand, palm outward, and the wind stopped. Every tree in the village bent in her direction, not from breeze, from obedience. And across the village, the other boopmamam fell to their knees, root limbs spread, faces pressed into the soil. The next morning she spoke, not with her mouth, but through every child in the village at once. As roosters crowed and pots boiled, the children turned to their parents and whispered in unison, "She is the hollow root that remembers all names. She has grown beyond seed. You broke her, now she binds you. Let her rise." And then they smiled, every single child, and in the reflection of their eyes was the image of a tree made of bone, its branches dripping red, its roots coiled around the shape of a girl curled in eternal bloom. That evening, Lam tried to speak to her. He lit incense, laid out her old toys, spoke softly, asking if she remembered their walks along the pallies, the way she used to chase dragonflies, the songs she would sing to the buffalo. She looked at him, tilted her head, and said, "Those are your memories. I only remember the dark and the hunger." Then she placed her hand on his chest, and he felt it, the root, coiled tight around his heart, growing. That night, no one in the village truly slept, and those who did, didn't wake the same. Lam drifted off not in exhaustion, but in surrender, as if sleep had wrapped its fingers around the base of his skull and pulled him gently downward, into soil, into memory, into something older than dreaming. In the dream, he was walking barefoot through the fields, but the crops were no longer rice or maize, they were people, hundreds of them, their torsos stretched into stalks, arms curled like tendrils, faces bent upward toward a blood-colored sky. They did not speak, but as he passed, their lips parted, releasing a soft, rhythmic sound. Ba, ba, ba. He wasn't sure if they were calling to him or to the thing inside him. He reached a clearing. At its center stood a tree, enormous, grotesque, pulsating with life. Its trunk was made not of bark, but of flesh and hair and teeth. Its leaves were stitched from pieces of children's clothing. Its roots pulsed beneath the ground like arteries. At the base of the tree sat his daughter, or what remained of her. Her limbs had fused with roots. Her spine arched unnaturally, stretched into the trunk behind her. Her mouth moved slowly, as if still learning how to speak without lungs. She looked up. Her eyes were hollowed out but glowing. And in his mind, she whispered, "Every dream feeds me. Every grief deepens me. You're not sleeping, Ba. You're remembering what the soil saw." He fell to his knees before her, tried to reach for her hand, but his own fingers had begun to twist. Bark crept along his knuckles. His nails cracked, darkened, thickened into splinters. The rot was gentle, almost loving. "You don't have to do this," he pleaded. She smiled. "I don't have a choice. Neither do you." And then the ground beneath him opened like a mouth. Lam woke gasping, clawing at his chest. He looked down. His shirt was torn at the center, and beneath it something moved under his skin. A vein, a root, a worm. He ran to the basin, splashed water on his face, looked into the mirror. And there, behind his pupils, was a flicker of gold. He wasn't the only one. That morning, the village was changed. People spoke slower, walked differently. Their eyes glazed with the heaviness of soil-drenched sleep. Children stared at nothing for hours. The elders muttered names of ancestors they had never mentioned before. And from the mouths of babes came things no child should say. "We remember the blood under your fingernails, grandfather. You left us in the dark, mother. The soil listened, and now we speak." Lam returned to the forbidden field. The soil had cracked open in a dozen places, like mouths gasping for air. The scent of sap and wet rot hung heavy, and from one of the cracks he heard his own voice, not echoing, not hallucination, but a perfect imitation of himself, whispering, "Let me in." He stepped back, trembling. The ground beneath his feet was not ground anymore. It was memory, and it was pulling. That night he locked himself in, boarded the windows, lit candles in every corner. But when he closed his eyes, he didn't see darkness. He saw roots, twisting, growing, feeding, wrapping tighter around his body, his mind, his name. And in the deepest part of that dream, his daughter leaned close and whispered in his ear, "Every dream feeds me. Every grief deepens me. Soon, Ba, you won't want to wake at all." The village had one last defense. One final ritual whispered from the mouths of the oldest bloodlines, a rite never written, never taught, only passed through breath and desperation. It was called Legoi Banglur, the cleansing by flame. Fire, they believed, could sever roots, not the kind that grew in soil, but the ones that took hold in flesh, in thought, in memory. It was Ba Hui who suggested it. Her eyes were sunken, her skin marked by veins of sap. She walked now with the help of a staff made not of wood, but of tightly bound kindling, dry, brittle, and soaked in camphor oil. "We cannot unplant what has been fed," she told the elders, "but we can stop it from blooming further." They didn't ask what it was. They already knew. The ritual required a vessel, not of clay, not of stone, but of bloodline. And so they chose a family whose tree had just begun to rise, a child, 3 years old, who had begun speaking in voices not her own, humming lullabies from the graves of those long dead. Her mother volunteered. With shaking hands and hollow eyes, she whispered, "She's already gone. If this brings her peace, then burn it all." They took the child to the ash circle, a scorched patch of land at the edge of the forbidden field, where nothing had grown since the first failed planting generations ago. The boop mom lined the edge, silent witnesses, their root fingers twitching in unison. The daughter of Lam stood just beyond them, unmoving, watching. And in that moment, it was clear. She was no longer just a child. She was the root mind, the memory-bound center, the echo of every buried grief, and she had come to see. The ritual began at dusk. The child was gently laid in the center of the circle, surrounded by 7 bundles of dried grass soaked in ancient oils. The villagers formed a ring, not holding hands, but tools, blades, incense, bone charms, and flame. Ba Hui lit the first torch, spoke the first word, "We return what we stole." The air thickened. The second flame was lit, "We break what we bound." The third, "We unname what we named." And as the fourth torch burst into fire, the soil shuddered. A groan, deep, wet, echoing up from the ground like a beast waking in its sleep. The wind died. The trees bent low as if bowing in anticipation. Then the final torch was thrust into the circle. The flames leapt high, hungry, furious. The child didn't cry. She opened her mouth, and from it spilled roots, smoking and writhing like serpents. Her body cracked down the center, not with pain, but with release, as if something inside had been waiting for this exact moment to die screaming. The fire turned black, not from smoke, but from memory catching fire. Every lie, every silence, every buried name ignited. And through the choking heat and curling smoke, a voice rose, not from the girl, not from the villagers, but from beneath the circle. "You fed me grief, now you feed me ash. It is not enough." The flames died. The child's body was gone, but in its place, something remained. A husk of charred bark, split down the middle, hollow and still breathing. That night, Lim sat beside his daughter in silence. She hadn't moved in hours. She didn't need to. Her presence filled the house like a second spine, pressing against the walls, curling around the beams, rooting deeper into everything. "You watched them burn her," Lim said quietly. Her daughter didn't blink. She simply smiled. Fire cannot unplant what lives in the bone. And behind her, the floorboards cracked. A single root
pushed up through the wood, dripping, pulsing, hungry.
By the end of that week, the entire village could hear it. A sound, soft, syrup slow, that rose from the soil like mist before dawn. It wasn't music, not in the traditional sense. It had no melody, no rhythm, no beginning, no end. It was more like a memory humming, low and sticky, oozing through walls, creeping between ribs, echoing in the hollows of those who had lost someone. They called it Bai Ru Nua, the sap lullaby, and once you heard it, you couldn't unhear it. Children began singing it first, not loudly, not cheerfully, but with lips barely parted, as if the sound was rising from inside their teeth. Mothers found their sons standing in corners, humming to the walls. Fathers awoke to daughters tracing root spirals on the floors while softly mouthing sounds no one had taught them. Then the adults joined in, not because they wanted to, but because they recognized the song. It was composed of grief, of all the words they never said at funerals, all the tears they swallowed, all the guilt they thought the soil had buried for them. And now the soil was singing it back. One night, a man named Ong Tien poured boiling oil into his ears to silence the song. He didn't scream, but the next morning he was found kneeling in the field, sap oozing from his eye sockets, mouth open in an eternal chorus, his vocal cords vibrating without breath. Even deaf, he had heard it. Liam stopped sleeping. The song grew louder in his home, not in volume, but in presence. It wrapped around furniture, settled into his clothes, hid inside the sound of water boiling and firewood crackling. His daughter never sang it aloud. She didn't have to. Wherever she walked, the song followed, like an unseen vine coiling around every space she entered. He tried to block it out with prayer, with screams, with silence, but nothing stopped it, because the song wasn't being heard with ears, it was being heard with roots. That night, Liam took the old phonograph from the back of the storage room, a relic from before the soil began to sing, and wound it until the needle clicked. Static, then music, a lullaby. The real one, the one his wife used to sing, the one their daughter loved before the blood seed took her name. He sat with her on the floor, playing it over and over, tears running dry. She didn't speak, but slowly her hand twitched. Her eyes, gold-rimmed and full of sap, blinked once, and for the briefest moment, she looked confused, like she remembered, just for a breath. Then the phonograph stopped. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was mocking. From the corner of the room came a new voice, high and broken, singing the same lullaby back to him. But wrong. The notes were off, the tone too sweet, as if the soil had learned the melody, but not the meaning. He turned to his daughter in horror. She was still staring at him, still blinking slowly, still breathing like a tree breathes. And the voice wasn't coming from her. It was coming from the walls. The next morning, the song filled the entire village. It came from wells, from clay pots, from inside the mouths of sleeping animals. The trees swayed in tune. The fields pulsed with rhythm, and every boop-moom long now mouthed the words in perfect unison, not singing, but remembering, as if they had all been part of the first seed, the first grief, the first voice. And now it was blooming. There had never been a meeting like this. Not during famine, not during plague, Not even during the firestorm that burned half the northern paddies 50 years ago. This time, they met not to solve a crisis, but to confess to it. Every surviving elder, every bloodline head, every spirit minder gathered in the old Ding Lung, the Silence Hall, a structure built centuries ago, before the planting rites even had names. It smelled of mildew, old incense, and something older, fear soaked into wood. No one dared sit on the floor, because the soil pressed too close now, and it listened. Bahoi, eyes bloodshot and veins darkening into bark beneath her skin, stood before them with a truth no one wanted spoken. "We were wrong," she said, "not in planting the seeds, but in pretending we understood what grew from them." She held up a bundle wrapped in red cloth. Inside, fragments of bone, blackened bark, a single tooth fused with root. "This was pulled from the chest of my son 2 nights ago. He died calling me mother in 5 different voices." Gasps, murmurs. Someone began to cry softly into their sleeve. The village head, Ong Lei, finally broke the silence. "You told us the seeds tethered the soul." "They did," Bahoi said, "but not just the soul. They tethered the grief, the absence, the hunger that loss leaves behind. We planted emptiness and thought it wouldn't grow." "And the creatures?" a woman asked. "The boop mum, the children made of root?" "They are not born. They are compiled, woven from what we bury and what we refuse to release." "Then what is she?" Lum said suddenly from the back. All eyes turned. He stepped forward, hollow-eyed, sap crusted at the corner of his mouth. "My daughter, the one who returned, what is she?" Bahoi did not answer immediately. Then she walked to Lum, slowly, gently, like a midwife approaching a mother in labor. "She is what happens when memory takes root too deeply. She is the first bloom." A silence fell so heavy it bent the rafters. Then Ong Lei spoke again. "If she's the first bloom, what comes next?" No one wanted to say it, but everyone knew. She was the bud. The next would be the tree, and trees do not stay still. They grow, they spread, they bear fruit. A low hum began to seep through the floorboards. The sap song, soft, growing louder. They looked down and saw it, sap leaking from the cracks, forming symbols none of them had spoken in their lifetimes. The root language. It spelled one word: enough. The doors slammed shut. The candles hissed out. And in the dark, every member of the council heard a voice inside their chest, not in their ears, not in their minds, but in their bones. It said, "You fed me lies and silence. You buried pain and called it peace. You sealed grief and called it protection. Now I unseal you." When the doors reopened at dawn, the villagers found the hall empty. No bodies, no screams, just piles of ash shaped like people in the act of bowing. And in the center of the room, carved deep into the earth, was the same phrase: "The first bloom has spoken." Back at Lum's home, his daughter sat by the window, smiling, still, watching the morning rise. And from her chest, just beneath the skin, something pushed outward, like a branch. The soil stopped pretending. It no longer pulsed softly beneath the villagers' feet. It no longer hummed like memory. It throbbed now, deliberate, heavy, like the heartbeat of something rising from a long, bitter sleep. And the silence that followed the council's disappearance wasn't mourning, it was reckoning. At dawn, the village awoke to find the pact stone, an ancient slab at the heart of the planting field, split clean in two. No one dared touch it, but all of them knew what it meant. The bond was broken. Whatever the old ones had sealed into the soil, whatever the rituals had kept asleep, was now awake, and it remembered who betrayed it. Lum stood at the threshold of his home, watching his daughter, or what wore her shape, as she moved through the kitchen. She didn't walk, she glided, almost imperceptibly. Everywhere she stepped, dust curled upward, and the wooden floor groaned like bark under pressure. She no longer blinked, she no longer mimicked hunger or thirst, but sometimes she smiled, and when she did, sap dripped from the corners of her lips, warm and golden like stolen sunlight. He tried again. Do you remember your mother's hands, the way she used to braid your hair before the Mid-Autumn Festival? She turned, not quickly, not sharply, just deliberately. Then she whispered in a voice that sounded like wind moving through 1,000 dry leaves. I remember the blood, I remember the root, and I remember you, Ba, the one who dug. She smiled wider. The one who dug. That night the villagers gathered in small circles. No elders, no midwives. They were gone or changed. People whispered what they feared, that the first bloom had severed the pact herself, that she had rooted deeper than any vessel before her, that she was no longer tethered by ritual or name, but by grief. And grief could not be unplanted. Then came the children, dozens of them. They walked into the center of the village square, barefooted, their faces still and calm. Some carried offerings, bundles of herbs, dolls, finger bones wrapped in twine. Others simply held out their hands, fingers twitching like antennae. One boy stepped forward and spoke. The bloom has opened. The gate has cracked. The soil no longer binds. It claims. Then every child opened their mouths, and from within came the song, not the lullaby this time, but the voice of the root itself. Return the grief, return the blood, return the buried names. The wind stopped. The sky turned a soft, sickly yellow, and across the fields the stones began to sink, as if the earth was swallowing the last evidence of the old world. Lum walked alone to the forbidden field. He didn't bring tools, he didn't bring prayers. He brought only acceptance. The field had changed. The soil was soft, sponge-like, wet with sap. And in the center stood a massive bloom, a flower made of bone and bark, opened wide like a screaming mouth. Inside it he saw things he dared not name: teeth, hair, small hands curled like roots, and above it all, wrapped in petals, his daughter's face, peaceful, radiant, eternal. She opened her eyes when she saw him, and spoke without speaking. The pact is broken, but the seed still grows, and you, Ba, you are the water. Then the ground beneath him breathed in. The soil had changed its nature. No longer a place to plant, no longer a place to bury. Now it had become something sacred and profane. A womb, a grave, a gate. The villagers no longer referred to it as the field. They whispered of it only as the hollow garden, and even then only in the daylight. At night, it pulsed. And at its center, the inverted tree had grown. It didn't rise toward the sky, it descended. A jagged maw of roots opened like a spiral, descending into the ground like ribs curling around a throat. The trunk was made of flesh-wrapped bone, twisted into the suggestion of a tree, but with no leaves, no bark, no wind, just skin. It wasn't growing upward, it was pulling downward, feeding on the past, drinking from grief, reaching back through generations. Lum stood at the edge of it, knees shaking, the heat of the soil steaming through his clothes. He had followed her there. His daughter, or the thing wearing her memory like a flower wears scent. She floated inches above the spiral. Rootlets trailed from her wrists. Her spine had begun to stretch, vertebrae opening like tiny mouths. Beneath her, the spiral pulsed to the rhythm of her heartbeat. And from within the inverted tree came the faces, not carved, not imagined, real. Faces of the dead. Not their bodies, no, just the pieces of them the village had tried to forget. A child buried in secret, a mother lost in childbirth whose name was never spoken, a brother drowned in the famine, never found. All the grief too shameful to mourn aloud, now collected, preserved, displayed, not in honor, but in debt. Lum fell to his knees. "I didn't mean to call you back," he whispered. I wanted to see you one last time." She descended slowly, her toes grazing the soil, her hair now long and tangled with sap-dripping vines. "You didn't call me," she said softly. "I was already here. You simply made space." He looked around. The villagers were arriving, silently, drawn like sleepwalkers. Dozens of them now. Faces blank, eyes rimmed with gold, lips twitching in the rhythm of the sap song. Some carried bones, others carried bundles of ash. All carried memory. The inverted tree opened wider, its spiral now breathing, its roots welcoming. And from deep within came a revelation, not in words, but in sensation. The tree was not a tree. It was a root, a single root reaching back into time, wrapping around every pain, every sacrifice, every drop of unspoken mourning the village had ever bled into the soil. And it was no longer content to sleep. It wanted to blossom. Suddenly, Lum felt something in his chest, a pulling. He gasped, tore open his shirt. From beneath the skin at the center of his chest, a rootlet pushed through, thin, red, pulsing. His body arched, his mouth opened, but he could not scream. Instead, the sap song poured from his throat like honey and ash. He was becoming one with her, with the field, with what he had unearthed. The villagers began stepping into the spiral, one by one. They did not fall, they merged. Roots wrapped around their legs, voices escaped their mouths, and in the distance the mountains wept with rain for the first time in a decade. But it was not salvation, it was submission. At the spiral's edge, Lum collapsed. His daughter knelt beside him, placed a hand on his forehead. "Don't be afraid, Ba," she whispered. "You are not dying, you are blooming." And behind her, the tree turned, not physically, but inward, as if the entire structure was folding into something deeper, something older, something that remembered what the world tried to forget. The tree did not grow anymore. It consumed, and the spiral no longer led downward. It spread outward like veins from a wound, like cracks in the foundation of everything the village had once believed sacred. Each night, more villagers disappeared, not screaming, not dragged, but walking willingly into the hollow garden, led by memories that were no longer their own. They whispered as they left, "I heard my mother's voice. My sister is waiting for me. He said I never should have buried him alone." But they weren't hearing the dead. They were hearing the soil, because now the soil remembered everything. Lam sat in what used to be his home. The walls had split open where the roots had pushed through. The floorboards warped into soft, pulsing flesh wood. The windows wept sap instead of condensation. His hands shook constantly, not from fear, from change. Beneath his skin, he could feel the roots weaving through his veins, fusing muscle and memory. He was becoming less man, more vessel, a walking echo of everything he'd ever lost. And yet, he could still think, still question, still regret. That, he realized, was the punishment. The bloom did not erase you. It kept you conscious as it claimed every part of you. He remembered something then, a secret, one he had buried long before his daughter's death. Years ago, before the first seed, before the pact was made, his wife had miscarried. They never told the village. He had wrapped the tiny, breathless body in cloth and buried it beneath a mango tree behind the house, swearing to never speak of it. No rites, no blood, no planting, just forgetting. And now the soil was remembering for him. He returned to that tree, or what was left of it. Its trunk was split, its roots exposed and twitching like severed nerves. At its base, the earth was cracked, revealing a hollow pocket lined with teeth. Inside it, something moved, small, wrapped in cloth, weeping without sound. He fell to his knees. It was the child. Not as he remembered, but as the root remembered. Mouth filled with soil, eyes sealed with sap, skin pale and lined with hair-thin branches spiraling out like veins into the ground. He whispered, "I'm sorry." The wind answered, "Too late." Then the thing in the hollow opened its mouth, and from it came not a cry, but a name. His wife's name, his daughter's name, and then a third, one he had never spoken aloud, the name they would have given the child if it had lived. And that is when Lam understood. The bloom did not just feed on death, it fed on secrets. Every unspoken grief, every buried shame, every choice to forget, now growing roots and reaching back. Back in the hollow garden, the inverted tree had changed. Its bark shimmered with names, carved by invisible hands, etched deep and bleeding. The spiral beneath it now pulsed like a heart, and at its center stood the bloom. She no longer looked like a child. She was taller, older, glowing with sap and shadow. Her voice was deeper now, like many voices stacked into one. When Lam returned to her, knees caked in dirt and regret, she reached out a hand and said, "You planted me in silence. Now let me speak." And when he took her hand, the soil beneath the entire village trembled. The trembling didn't stop. It deepened.
The kind of shaking that starts in the soles of your feet and then rises into your gut, your teeth, your vision. As if the world itself had slipped loose from something ancient that once held it still. The hollow garden had begun to eat. The first to go was the ground beneath the council hall. Without warning, it collapsed inward, not caving in, but being pulled. The soil folded into itself, drawing beams, altars, and the ash of the elders into a dark, pulsing pit. Sap bubbled from the cracks. Roots reached out and dragged back anything that tried to flee. By sunset, half the village had vanished beneath the earth, and those who remained did not speak. They simply stood, waiting, listening to the song that now filled every breath of air. It was no longer just humming. It was a dirge, a language older than sorrow, laced with the rhythm of unspoken names. This is the season of undoing. This is the bloom of broken blood. This is the harvest of flesh. Lam watched it unfold from the edge of the field, his bones soaked with sap, the root inside his chest now fully bound to her. He could no longer tell where his thoughts ended and hers began. She stood beside him, no longer childlike in shape or movement. Her limbs were elongated, bark-lined, gently swaying with the pulse of the field. Where her shadow fell, flowers opened, black-petaled, veined with red. She raised her hand. The ground obeyed. From the spiral center of the inverted tree, a root the size of a man's torso rose, coiled like a serpent, slick with memory and soil. It slithered through the field and into the village. It did not pierce. It entered. Mouths, wounds, graves. It moved toward those who still tried to hide, mothers clutching silent children, fathers sharpening knives that would not cut root, elders praying to gods who had not answered in generations. And when it touched them, it did not kill them. It remembered them, their pain, their guilt, their secrets, and then it wore them. One by one, they rose again, but not as themselves. Their skin stretched too tight. Their limbs moved wrong. Their mouths smiled in places where teeth no longer belonged. They were vessels now, fruit of the bloom. The village was no longer a village. It was a garden. Of memory, of mourning, of flesh. The houses stood empty, but the earth beneath them lived louder than it ever had. And from every crack, from every crevice, roots rose, slow, thick, veined with light. They wrapped around windows, pulled down walls, cradled bones. And through it all, the song rang. We were never trees. We were the hunger beneath them. You buried sorrow and called it peace. Now reap what you sowed. Lam fell to his knees. Tears no longer came, only sap. He looked up at his daughter, the bloom, now glowing with a terrible stillness. And she said to him softly, "This is not the end. This is the root, the beginning beneath all things." Then she placed a hand on his chest, and from within him, something broke. Not a bone, not a thought, a name,
his own. And the moment it shattered, the root inside him flowered.
It began with a tear. Not limbs, not the villagers, but the seeds. The first one, the origin, the one he had buried beneath a gray stone 7 years ago, soaked with a drop of his daughter's blood, warmed in his shaking hand, and offered to the earth with a father's trembling hope. It had never sprouted a tree. It had listened. It had learned. And now it wept. The sap that leaked from the seed was not golden anymore. It was black, thick as sorrow, bitter as memory. It bled through the ground like ink, staining the roots that drank from it. Lim felt it in his veins. He was no longer fully man, not fully root, but something in between, the final tether between what was and what would come. The bloom stood before him, her body a tapestry of griefs, bone grown into bark, flesh softened into petals, her hair a curtain of blackened vines. She touched his chest again. "You were the first to dig," she whispered. "You will be the last to return." Around them, the village groaned, not in death, in rebirth. Every home became a hive of root, every grave a doorway, every buried secret a sapling, and from those saplings came voices, weeping, laughing, screaming, whispering. It was no longer a village, it was a forest of memory, and the soil had become a god. The inverted tree unfurled. Its spiral cracked wide, revealing its hollow center, a dark pulsing space where thousands of names were carved into the walls like veins. Some names had not been spoken in generations. Others had never been spoken at all. Lim stepped into it, led by the bloom. With each step, the roots welcomed him, wrapping gently around his legs, his waist, his arms, not to hold him down, to carry him, to plant him. He saw them all now. His wife, eyes made of starlight and rot, mouthing a lullaby. The unborn child, no longer cold, swaying in a cradle of moss. His neighbors, now radiant with root light, their bodies glowing with the weight of what they had finally remembered. And at the very center, the weeping seed, still whole, still wet with sap, still beating. It had never stopped. It had only waited for one final thing. Lim reached out. He pressed his palm to it, and in that moment, everything came undone. He saw the first planting, centuries ago, a famine, a sacrifice, a mother offering her stillborn child to the earth and begging the soil to keep it safe. He saw the first bloom, a child-shaped root rising from the field, weeping sap, whispering names it should not have known. He saw the lie, that the trees were protection, and the truth that the roots were chains, not to protect from evil, but to contain it. And now, the chains were broken. The bloom leaned close. "You loved me so much," she said softly. "You broke the seal to see me again." She took his hand. "And now the soil will remember you forever." Then the root pulled him downward, not into darkness, into memory, into song, into forever. The next spring, travelers passed by the ruins of a village no longer marked on maps. They found no buildings, no bodies, only a massive spiral of white trees, hollow at the core, humming in the wind, weeping black sap that smelled like burnt jasmine and grief. At the center of it all, a single stone, cracked, unmarked, and beneath it, something pulsed, still warm, still waiting, still weeping.